Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Colleen Lezovitz, and I'm a Senior Marketing Manager at Worldwide Clinical Trials, and I would like to welcome you to today's webinar, which we are pleased to host in recognition of Heart Month, Tales from the Trenches, the Unique Challenges of Cardiovascular Outcome Trials. Before we do kick things off, I wanted to go over a few things. All attendees are on mute, but please use the questions window to submit questions at any time pertaining to the presentation, as we will be reserving time for Q&A at the end. There is also some worldwide cardiovascular handouts available for download, which you can access in the handouts section of your console. This webinar is being recorded, and all attendees will receive an email with a link to access the on-demand recording. So with that, I would like to go ahead and introduce our speakers for today. We have Karen Hill, who is the Senior Vice President, Global Therapeutic Leader for our Cardiometabolic franchise. Then we have Nancy Newark, who's Executive Director, Project Management for our Cardiometabolic franchise. And finally, we have Christy Koppenhaver, who's a Program Clinical Data Manager. Before we dive into the presentation, we did want to hear from all of you. So I'm going to go ahead and share out a poll. So if everybody can take a few seconds to respond, and then we will share the results.
Hi, so the question is, when was physical inactivity and obesity found to increase the risk of heart disease? If you can select one of those answers.
Thank you, Karen. And I do see the responses coming in, so we'll give everybody a few more seconds. We almost have 100% participation. Okay. All right, I'm going to go ahead and share out the results. We have 23% have responded 1945, 31% have responded 1952, 38% have responded 1967, and 8% have responded 1978.
So the correct answer is actually 1967. So well done to the 38% of you who guessed that correctly. However, I'm not sure if anybody else was surprised, but I was. I thought that the awareness of something like inactivity and obesity with relating to heart disease was something that people would be more aware of, even back more than 5 decades ago. I at least thought that my parents and perhaps even my grandparents would have been aware of how those activities or inactivity really do increase the risk of heart disease. So yeah, I was quite surprised at the answer to that. So Worldwide's history of working on large cardiovascular outcome trials does go back many decades. These are post-approval trials, which were also mandated for new anti-diabetic therapies by the FDA in 2008, and then a little later than that in 2012 by EMA. And we are now seeing that new obesity therapies are also required to undergo these types of studies. So we're certainly seeing an expansion of outcome studies. So what are cardiovascular outcome trials and what makes them so different? So cardiovascular outcome trials by definition involves thousands of patients and hundreds of sites globally, as well as huge amounts of data from ECRF pages to endpoints and resources, whether they're CRAs to perform hundreds and thousands of site visits or just the personnel that's needed to run these types of study, whether within the CRO or within the sponsor. And these are easily the biggest investment a company will make in cardiovascular research and development, and where they will spend millions of dollars. But these studies also require attentive relationship management across all stakeholders, and collaboration is key in managing these types of studies. Sponsors often partner with academic research groups and key opinion leaders that, although have a wealth of experience, may bring other challenges and often their own agendas. Therefore, requiring clearly defined roles and responsibilities to be safety established early on, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a short while. These studies are not just twice the size of, say, a phase 2 or 3 study, for instance, leading to twice the number of resources being deployed. They are usually more than tens of times larger. Processes have to be scalable, which then hopefully will lead to efficiencies both in time and cost. So during this webinar, we will highlight what is important, but also some of the challenges we have seen using a recently completed study to showcase how we overcame these. Next slide, please. So due to their size and complexity, it is important to understand that once these large trials have begun, it is extremely difficult to steer them in a different direction. Protocol amendments and database changes should be avoided, and trial objectives should remain focused with only the most relevant information collected. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about some of the ideas we've had to help facilitate that. However, these vast databases are enormously valuable and not only give us an understanding of the specific intervention, but also the disease, and can be used to answer other more general medical questions relating to the study population. And these trials are often referenced in ongoing publications and articles for many years, and can be used and often used in meta-analysis looking at general patient populations and how the disease has progressed, and some of the information, even going back more than 5 or 10 years, is still very relevant today. Next slide, please. So what are some of the common challenges? We've already mentioned the high financial costs associated with these types of studies, and we need to continue to find ways to bring these costs down. We need to look at how we can streamline things like data collection. Nancy and I actually worked on with an interesting client last year who had been mandated to do an outcome study with their compound. And we went through, I want to say, probably about 8 iterations of the budget, which took us from $100 million plus down to $14 million. Nancy, do you want to just explain some of the issues that we had and some of the solutions that we gave them?
Yes, thank you, Karen. It was very interesting, and we really kind of challenged the status of how we approach studies. And one of the things, of course, we know that with these outcome studies, we have to implement a targeted, reduced, SDV and monitoring strategy. Also, utilizing, an in-house team, an in-house CRA team to support, site management, and to allow the field CRAs to really focus on the visits. But we also looked at some other opportunities to reduce, the number of monitoring visits and the time on site. And one of those was looking at the recommendation of really eliminating the source data verification that has previously been required for the events that occur. So typically in these the studies, we identify what endpoints, what events we're going to be adjudicating. Those events get processed, source documents are collected, a dossier is prepared, and that goes to an adjudication committee, a group of physicians that are essentially doing a source data review to be able to determine if this particular event occurred or did not occur. And one of the things we've observed is we often do a duplication of SDV. We also have the CRA review that on site as well. So we were able to reduce the amount of monitoring, reduce the amount of time on site, and of course, reduce the budget substantially by suggesting that you don't really need to do both. You either can have an adjudication committee, or you should have source data verification by the CRA on site. So that was one thing that we found substantially impacted the budget. The other thing we looked at, of course, is the grant fees. The investigator fees are typically extremely high with these studies, not only because of the procedures sometimes that need to be done, but also just the length and the number of visits that the subject is required to come into the clinic. during these, during the follow-up. So we looked at streamlining the requirements for the clinic visits, which certainly had a huge impact on the grant fees, but also looking at opportunities to say, does every visit have to be in person, with the subject? Can we alternate, for example, have the subject come in for a clinic visit, but then have the next contact with the subject be a telephone contact, where very specific questions are asked. Of course, making sure that the subject has enough of the study drug in hand, so that they're not required to come back to the clinic very frequently. So those are just a couple examples of things that we found were had a huge impact on the budget.
Thanks, Nancy.
So thanks,
yeah, and one of the other things that we also looked at was also just, from a statistical point of view, and the patient population is looking at whether we count the time to first event, and then we continue to be able to count events in that same patient, or whether we just, there's a possibility just that we have to, say, well, once the patients had their first event, then we can't count any further. We did a lot of analysis and worked with our statisticians and our medical team to work out whether how that could influence. And as I said, we went through many iterations of that budget, and there was a significant amount of cost savings that we could make depending on the scenario. So, timelines are traditionally long, as Nancy's mentioned, for these studies, and that obviously relates directly to this high cost. There also continues to be increased competition for qualified investigators and sites. These studies can be very attractive to some PIs as they bring in a steady revenue, but we also need to ensure that they have the time and the capacity to handle both the patient and the data volumes. We see in many of these studies sites recruiting tens of patients, but also can get close to 100 patients. And it's very easy for them to do that, but it's also, we need to make sure that they understand the time constraints, and sometimes even competing with study coordinator times or other site staff times from other indications. So it may be the cardiologist knows how much work needs to be done, but they don't necessarily know how much other work the pharmacist and the study coordinators working on other therapeutic areas may also be involved. So we need to make sure that they have the capacity to be able to not only bring the patients in, but also be able to see them. And Christy will talk a little bit later about some of the numbers of and volume of work that's needed, particularly in the closeout of a study. So large patient populations and long follow-up periods, as I say, are required. These trials often take 18 to 24 months to recruit, and then they're often followed by another maybe 2 to 3 years or more of follow-up. The Improve It study was an example of a study which was completed a few years ago. This was in patients in lipid lowering, and that started out aiming to recruit 10,000 patients. Unfortunately, they had to increase both its number of patients and the number of endpoints because they saw early on that they weren't going to get to the end of the study with the current 10,000. And then in addition, they went from 12,000 patients to finally needing to recruit 18,000 patients. And that study took almost 10 years from the first patient being recruited to the last visit for that final patient coming out of the study was almost 10 years. So that was a long time. And obviously you can imagine the costs and the resourcing that was needed to support that. There's also regulatory and administrative barriers to overcome to ensure that the right questions are answered, and in particular the FDA and the regulatory bodies are satisfied. So it's important to understand what they're asking and that we're answering those questions. These are not studies that we can repeat. The size of them, the cost of them doesn't allow us that flexibility. Also, working up front with our sponsors is key to ensure simple things like just the availability of their resources to provide documentation. At the beginning of a study, for instance, we need IMPDs, we need protocols, we need our investigator brochures, or even more complex issues like, do they have burdensome contracting language and multiple review cycles, which obviously adds time on our side if we're negotiating contracts with the sites, but also the sponsors' time in reviewing those changes or potential changes coming back for the sites. And we've seen in many instances, even some of the large companies that we work for, that is a rate limiting step, because normally their legal department is looking at perhaps just a handful of contracts, or may not even be looking at site contracts if they're in between studies, for instance. So we really need to ensure that timelines at both sides are met, so that we're not delaying either the review that goes back to the site or the site coming back to us. So they also can be a disconnect between clinical research and medical care. These types of studies often include sub-studies or studies within studies, and finding the right balance is critical, as anything outside of standard of care will be expensive in such large trials. And as Nancy mentioned, that investigator grants often are half of the R&D budget for these types of studies. And it's critical that we don't overburden the site. If we can keep the data collection and the standards, the standard testings as close to standard of care as we possibly can, then obviously we just need to pay for that extra extra work that the site needs to do, whether that's data entry and informing, consenting patients, etc. So again, this can soon spiral costs if we start adding sub-studies or we start adding extra procedures, which often, are a great these studies give us a great opportunity to look at a large number of patients, but of course then, the cost needs to be balanced. Lengthy contracting and approval cycles of academic institutions have led us in more recent years to look for ways to recruit patients in, say, more typical settings, so primary care and community-based physicians. And a few studies that we're currently actually still recruiting for, we've had some great success moving away from some of the more academic and large institutions. They give us a great base of patients, but these more community-based settings give us the ability to be able to recruit without some of the bureaucracy. Again, we know these studies have to be truly worldwide in order to include the number of sites and patients to deliver these studies on time and effectively. But again, adding extra geographies into studies can be expensive, as each time we add a new country, we've obviously got additional fees with regards to ethics and regulatory, and then startup of those sites, etc. So let's look at our case study. So this is a study that we completed quite recently, within the last year or so. So this was a study where we had 500 sites in 12 countries, and the countries involved North and Latin America, and then Eastern Europe and Asia Pacific, specifically Australia and New Zealand. Nancy.
Yep, thank you, Karen. Yes, and just looking at the data, there was 10,000 patients were randomized. And the sites had to screen over 13,000 subjects to get the 10,000 patients into the study. The recruitment period was 20 months, and that again is a really typical time frame. Between 18 and 24 months is usually our target. The monitoring was substantial. We did over 10,000 site monitoring visits for this particular study, and it did run over a 5-year period. So Christy, if you can give us some updates about the data management, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Nancy. So this was an intent to treat study where subjects were followed for about 2.5 years following randomization. This turned into approximately 1.5 million CRF pages and 1.2 million queries. That query number does include both manual and system edit checks that were built into the system. On average, the subjects did have between 11 and 17 on-study visits, depending upon when they were randomized. Throughout the course of the study, we did process about 3,760 endpoint events. Okay, back to you, Karen.
Thanks, Christy. So let's have a little bit more of a deep dive into the case study. So we're going to present 5 lessons that we felt were interesting and also we think will be useful. So for this particular instance, we had multiple partners, and this included, which these studies often do, our sponsor. We had to work with an academic research organisation, an ARO, and obviously there's ourselves as the CRO. And what we realised is that everybody needed and wanted to review all of the core documents, the site lists. We all worked together to build the EDC platform and review the ECRF variables, and also the project plans and processes were needed to be reviewed and approved by all 3 parties. So what we found was that we felt there was going to be a high potential risk that this would cause delays in the startup of the trial, given that everybody needed to review things, and obviously review cycles can take time. So what we decided to do was we implemented from the very start of the study regular meetings and ensured that we had consistent communication among all of the 3 parties. We also set very strict timeline expectations. So if we knew that we needed to have something ready and people had 24 hours to review, we made that very clear, or if there was other documentation that perhaps we could take longer to review, so that each individual group could ensure that we received their comments, and then we got together, discussed those, and then ensured that we had consensus that we could move forward with, as I say, whatever it was, whether it was the EDC platform, the process itself, or just straightforward project plans and documentation. So this actually helped immensely. We didn't have any further delays. We minimized, sort of the time it took between reviewing documentation by, as I say, having calls and meetings to do things. And then we formed actually a very strong partnership between the 3 groups. And actually that also continued throughout the full phases of the study. It became, as you can imagine, very critical during the conduct phase of the study. As we've mentioned before, once patients are recruited, there's then a long follow-up period. And that can often be a period when perhaps people start to get a little bit complacent, and we'll talk about some of the things that we did to make sure that we were on track with our timelines. And then obviously became critical again during the closeout of the study. So again, it just became very apparent that we needed to work together. And I think, as I mentioned before, in these types of large studies where academic groups or key opinion leaders, KOLs, are involved, it's so critical that the 3 main parties stay in contact with each other, but also, we say the same thing. Next slide, please. So the second lesson we thought was useful to share with you is maximizing partnerships to manage third parties. And as you can imagine, in these studies, there's often many third parties. So there's often a central laboratory, there's drug depots and distribution groups. So we had a particular instance in a vendor that we had contracted actually by the sponsor, which again is very typical, where the sponsor will have relationships with their vendors and then bring those to these types of studies. But then from an CRO perspective, we then have to manage that and work very closely with that vendor. So this vendor was involved in the startup of the study and gave us a platform where we could upload documents and sites could interact with that platform too. And what became very evident quite quickly was that the vendor system didn't seem that it was fit for purpose, but only because it hadn't been designed for such large trials with such large volumes of sites and data which needed to be collected. So we worked very closely with them because what we needed to determine was the platform scalable, and it didn't seem like it was. But actually sitting down with the vendor and again having the ability to do that along with the sponsor, because they held the contract, became critical. So again, having that open dialogue, being upfront with each other and really sort of delving into what the issues was. So we sat and we trained them and made them understand what we needed. Transparency of the data was one of the biggest issues. So the data, we didn't know whether sites were ready to be started up this month or next month. We were finding out that sites who we thought were ready to go, documents were missing. And then we also were in the opposite position where we were told at sort of the last minute that a site was actually, we've got everything, and we weren't ready to initiate them because we didn't have the resource in the right place to go out on a site initiation visit quickly. So, you know, if you really think about it, you know, they had to really think about scaling their technology up from just, initiating a few sites perhaps every week to initiating hundreds of sites all at the same time. So this was something that we worked together with. We had a great relationship with this particular vendor, and we will continue to work with them even outside of this particular study. So it also increased the confidence with the site staff. So they were, communicating that they were also having challenges, and also us being proactive and improving the system gave them confidence that also that we, if we had any issues during the course of the study, we would implement those too. So Nancy, do you want to introduce the next lesson?
Yes, thank you, Karen. So the next lesson we wanted to share was really some challenges related to the regulatory path or the regulatory strategy. And we did have some unanticipated questions by some of the country authorities that did delay some of our approvals, and of course then that would delay our site activation. So one of the things that we've implemented and that we had implemented was really upfront having a detailed feasibility analysis, that when we were looking at picking the right countries and picking the best sites, we also identified countries, as backup, and also sites as backup, just not knowing, again, what the regulatory authority feedback was going to be. So we did have some slight delays, but having this feasibility data, having information on other countries that would be feasible for the study really helped us anticipate and really identify some other countries that we could activate quickly, and sites that we could, that were, qualified to conduct the study. We were able to, in some areas and some countries where the local regulations allowed it, when sites prior to being activated, they did pre-identify potential subjects. So once they were activated, they had their subjects identified, and they were able to start scheduling them to come into the clinic for for an assessment to ensure that they met the eligibility criteria. It turned out that we really didn't need all the countries and the sites that we had anticipated. Enrollment went very quickly. We had selected really high performing sites in all the countries. And so some of the countries that would come up later in the regulatory process ended up not needing to be activated because enrollment did go so quickly. And some of the countries enrolled so fast that we needed to put them on hold to allow other countries an opportunity to put subjects in. So again, I think the lesson we learned here is that, having a really broad feasibility analysis, knowing what countries are, well suited for the patient population and for the study, and then having a backup plan so that if there are unanticipated, regulatory questions, that you're well positioned to bring on new countries and additional sites if needed. So let's move on to the next slide and look at another lesson related to this case study. So, patient retention is really critical these long outcome studies. Keeping the subjects engaged and continuing to be able to follow up with them and keep them in the study. And also, as Karen mentioned, keeping the site staff engaged is also important, because if they're enthusiastic about the study and they're engaged, then they're going to keep their subjects, they're going to keep in contact with their subjects. So, patient retention strategies really begin early, with the protocol design, really looking at what the requirements are for patient follow-up and what opportunities do you have to be able to be realistic about keeping subjects in studies for a really long time. And one example that, that often comes up is that, is there any opportunity for subjects to take, what we would call like a drug holiday? Can they take any breaks during the study follow-up period? What do you do if a subject, goes on a long holiday? Or we also had many situations where in these long studies where subjects, moved from one country to another or from one region or another, and how do we keep them in the study, and how do we potentially move them to another investigative site so that they can be followed up locally to where where they've relocated. So these are all things that we address up front in the protocol. Again, are there opportunities for the patients to come, the subjects to come off study drug for a short period of time? Is that, and then have them come back on study drug? And in this particular study, there was an opportunity for subjects to take a break if they needed to for whatever reason, but we still kept them in the study. They could still come back on study drug, and their data was still, valuable for the study analysis. The other thing that's really important is really the language and how you inform the subjects about retention and staying in the study, and how we can obtain, vital status and information about them if at any time, we lose contact. So collecting, very detailed contact information when the subject first consents to the study. How can we reach them? Do they have multiple phone numbers? Who would be a backup? Who else would the subject give us permission to call if if we couldn't reach them for any reason? And those kind of contact details are really critical to maintain throughout the study, so that if at any time the study coordinator is unable to reach the subject, they can call a backup or an alternate telephone number. So the language that we use in informed consents are really been utilized for many years, and regulatory authorities approve the language around how we can obtain information about a subject if we can't contact them, and that how we can utilize public available sources to determine whether the patient is still alive, or or are we looking at for example death records to confirm that the patient has died. So we do let the patients know in the informed consent that it's critical for them to maintain contact with them, that we will be the sites will be calling them on the phone, the sites will be looking at publicly available information in the event that we're not able to reach them or contact them. We also put in place up front, a way to flag or identify subjects that are at risk for being lost to follow-up. And those criteria, vary from study to study, but for this particular study, if the subject missed one visit, didn't show up to one visit, then that was flagged, and that subject was put into a risk for being lost to follow up. That would trigger our team to contact the site and find out was the subject did they not show up, or did they call ahead and cancel the visit? Has there been another visit rescheduled? Has the site had any contact with that subject? And so that then moves them back into whether they're high risk or low risk. If a subject misses 2 visits, then they do become, flagged as a high risk for loss to follow up. And we put strategies in place with the sites to reach out to the subjects so that we don't lose contact with them. As we, as contact becomes, we're not able to contact the subjects for a period of time, then we are able to use a patient finder service in all the countries that we worked in to be able to look at, again, publicly available information to see if we could make any kind of contact, with the subject. And as we closed the study, really looking at being able to collect vital status information on all of the subjects. So you can see in this particular case study, we had less than 2% of the overall subjects were lost to follow-up.
Thanks, Nancy. I just wanted to also add a couple of other examples of where some of the information that Nancy's given was really sort of became quite pertinent. So I mentioned earlier the Improve It study. And said to you that, it finished a couple of years ago and it took 10 years. Back at the beginning of that study, we didn't have the consent language to allow patients to be perhaps followed up in even if they got consent, even just by medical record review, that sort of thing. So I think in the end, we had 3 ICF updates during the course of that study for various reasons, as I say, including asking the patients to consent that if they did withdraw, any patients that they did withdraw after that they would allow us to contact their physicians or find out, their vital status, as Nancy mentioned. So yeah, the ICF upfront sort of approaching these patients to make them understand that we're not going to do anything that they don't want us to do, but again, it's important that they understand that going into the study means that we would like, and it's critical obviously for the data at the end of the day to get their status. And then just a couple of other examples. We did a study called Proactive. This was actually a type 2 diabetes drug. Again, actually a Europe mandated study, long-term outcome study looking at cardiovascular risks. And again, using the concept of potentially loss to follow-up was key in that study. And with over 5,000 patients, we ended up with only 2 patients classified as lost to follow, which was a huge achievement for that team. And actually, this was a study that even when it finished, we then had 10 years of following those patients up just twice a year off the drug for further long-term assessments. And again, we had a very small percentage of patients that continued to drop out of the follow-up that were still alive and continue to not be able to find vital status on even after 10 years. So that was a great achievement. And then more recently, the TRA2P study, which was a 26,500 patient study. Again, by the end of that study, we managed to get down to less than 1% classified as lost to follow-up. And as many of you who have ever worked in this area, this is one area that, even the sort of academic group that surrounds the cardiovascular indication, they want to know how many lost to follow-up patients or how many patients weren't able to find vital status on. So it's an interest both to the academic community but also obviously to the regulators. So Christy, do you want to take us through the final lesson?
Yeah, thanks, Karen. So the challenge that we faced was how to get over 9,400 visits data entered correctly over a 3-month period while ensuring that the data was cleaned along the way. In order to do this, we ensured we had a fit-for-purpose database using dynamic workflows, a robust reporting module, as well as predefined cleaning milestones to prepare for the closeout period. For example, once all subjects had completed their visits 1 through 5, we established a target date to have those visits cleaned and locked in the database and performed cleaning sweeps on them using data listings, edit check review, etc. And then we were able to meet those targets to get us closer to that closeout period. We had close collaboration with the clinical team, maintained through good communication and via a closeout reporting tool, which allowed us to prioritize and track all subject visits. It included updates on data entry and also included subject follow-up status so that the entire study team was well aware of where the subjects were in the study at all times. We then utilized a robust site escalation plan along with the sponsor and ARO involvement to ensure that data was being entered and queries resolved on time. We would assess if a site was being unresponsive with queries and they had a certain time period and the CRA contact, and they would go through different steps, and then if we still were unable to get response, they would go to the next level and the next level, you know, until going through project management and then to the sponsor and the ARO. We also implemented a comprehensive training plan for both the sites and the study team, as well as communication paths for questions. We started out by holding, you know, training meetings and going over the different kinds of data entry that would be required during closeout. Lots of documentation and updates to the CCGs and you know, gave them out to the sites so that they'd have something on hand that they could refer to as they were performing their data entry. The in-house CRAs and the CRAs would also follow up very frequently with the sites to answer any questions that they had, and any questions that they were unable to answer would be escalated through a path until they were able to get a timely resolution. All of these strategies combined with a full team effort did result in on-time database lock, as well as on-time regulatory filing and publications. So back to you, Karen.
Thanks, Christy. And actually, this was as I say, this was a study that finished a little while ago, but it's actually been a good basis for a current study that we're working on, where actually both Christy and Nancy are going through the closeout, particularly of an even larger study, and some of these processes have given us a really good foundation to be able to work for you know, in the current situation, but also I think to give us again that understanding that we do need that really close collaboration. We need those really strong links, both between the us and our partners in the sponsor and the ARO, but also within our internal functions. And so, you know, it's been critical to have that strong relationship with data management. And we're lucky that we've got a team, as I say, working on a current study that's had such great experience in the past and given us that basis for being able to move forward and do this and continue to improve our processes so that we can even get better at it. So let me recap and go through some of the key success factors. So again, as we know, successful ARO and CRO partnerships leads to access to some of the top performing sites and PIs, and that really is where, you know, I think we have a strong relationship with our academic partners. Engagements from key opinion leaders, country leaders, national lead investigators, is also critical, and again, you know, they play a big part in these types of studies. And in the 20+ years that I've worked in this area, you know, we've seen PIs go from being site PIs to now being our trusted study leads, and it's nice to see people work through that process and work with us for that long. So we know that integrated technology for streamlined data collection, but also electronic document collection, leads us to having transparent metrics, and that's critical so everybody is on the same page. And going back to our example earlier, if we weren't able to see where sites were and who was ready to initiate it, it was difficult for us to get the rest of the team downstream in the right place at the right time. And obviously during the course of the study, it's always critical to be able to see where things are, and, you know, knowing how clean the database is, knowing how much SDV has been done is all needed so that we can be on top of things before we start the closeout process. Competitive investigator fees. Nancy mentioned that we need to sort of have a fine balance. This is an area that we can save lots of money, but it's also an area that we can spend lots of money. So it's this is an obvious way to get sites to participate in trials, but we need to keep things simple, not overcomplicate our protocols. We should really avoid nice to haves. Again, as Nancy mentioned, robust recruitment and retention plans. These need to start, activities need to start before launch really, and protocol design can also impact the recruitment and retention of these patients. These should not be implemented when things are not going well or at the time of closeout. It really isn't the time to start thinking about how many patients have we not had contact with for the last few months, and do we need to start looking at ways to track those patients down and start sending them registered letters, those sorts of things. So upfront pre-screening activities, even requesting sight of these before we begin the study. So I know that we don't want to be collecting information before we have any ethics approval, but sites can be encouraged to look through databases and share that information, obviously in a blinded fashion. We don't want to expose information that we shouldn't be seeing, to show that they have done that exercise and the types of patients or the volume of patients they can recruit. And I think that lends itself to lots of other types of studies, but this particular study, and that was one of the successes that we've had with a number of studies that we've brought in either ahead of schedule from a recruitment perspective or on schedule, because we have lined those sites up who have got patients. And actually one of the challenges of these types of studies is switching sites off, because if they've got patients lined up or they've got a big pool of pre-screening patients to go at, they often don't like it if the timelines get pulled forward and they don't have the time to recruit all of their patients. So keeping trial procedures close to standard of care, as I mentioned before, is also a critical thing. That obviously has a huge cost impact if we have to pay for extra care or procedures. And Nancy touched on the monitoring. So smart and adaptive monitoring can make a significant cost savings too. So remote monitoring, these is often completed by lower cost resources, so they don't have to perhaps have that the same technical knowledge as a CRA going out on site. Flexible on-site visit plan. These types of studies, if we tell everybody that they're going to be visited every 6 to 8 weeks, you can imagine the sorts of scale of the monitoring visits. You saw the number for a reduced SDV plan. You can imagine that it's probably sort of 2 or 3, even 3 times more than that if we were to do a regular visit schedule for these types of studies. So we need to go where the data is. And then tiered SDV, also based on risk techniques, can also lead to cost savings and allow us to focus on the important data and the endpoints. So again, perhaps even not focusing on endpoints could be something that we look at in the future if we're adjudicating that data and looking at the source notes. That's something that Nancy mentioned earlier. So now we're going to hand it over to you. We have just over 10 minutes to see whether you have any questions. So as you can also see on the screen, there's our contact details. So would also like to hear from any of you that would like to send us any questions to us directly. But if you do have any questions for us now, please do submit those via your chat functionality.
Thank you, Karen. There are a few questions coming in. If you want to go ahead and take a look, Karen, to start the answering.
Okay, so the first one is, do regional differences in standards of care help or hinder study execution? So this is, this is a sort of I guess a double-edged question, because we do see obviously differences in standards of care, and I think some of you that may have been aware of a couple of studies that were reported over the last couple of years, particularly were concerned about some of the data coming out of Eastern Europe and particularly the CIS region, where it looked like the the patient population was affecting the overall result. And we have seen in outcome studies where Eastern European geographies in particular, they may not be have the same tolerance, or they have a higher tolerance for adverse events, for instance. So we don't see as many of them reporting adverse events and SAEs in particular, which often for these types of studies are also endpoints. So we do have to be a little bit careful with the geographies from that perspective. But I think, you know, they've got much better in more recent years, and obviously we try to train the PIs to so that, you know, we can make sure that they understand how to get that information out of patients, because if, you know, patient in some of these geographies have a cold, they don't see that as an issue, and therefore don't feel that they need to report it. So yes, there is differences, but we expect those differences too. And obviously, ultimately, at the end of the day, the plan is to get these drugs marketed in, you know, globally. So we do need to look at all of the geographies. Okay, the second question is, what are outcome trials requirements for orphan rare diseases? So we haven't worked so much in that particular area, but yes, I mean, there is a question that needs to be answered, and often it's a good way with an orphan drug and rare diseases where we would have we start off in these types of studies, but then they often then have, you know, look at more long term, you know, what happens to these patients. So what usually happens is that we end up doing a study for a particular area where we need to focus, say, more on, you know, the indication itself. Does that particular drug satisfy, you know, what we want it? And then we look at more long-term follow-up. And what we've done in the past, it very much depends on the disease area, is that we can have, you know, we could have that long-term data collected with an open label extension sort of environment, depending on you know, what the drug is. I mean, for instance, we've done a study recently in pulmonary arterial hypertension, and we're doing, you know, you know, it's classified as a rare disease, and how we're collecting the long-term data is through our open label extension. So patients are recruited, they're in the study for about a year, they're followed up for another 6 months in the study, and then they go into an open label extension, and that's where we can collect the long-term data until we get the product marketed. So what is implied by scalable operational infrastructure is another question that we've had. And that really is going back to that example where we were using technology that we thought was appropriate for a study, when we realized actually that just the volume of data, the volume of users, the volume of people needing to see that data had an impact on its you know, usability for this particular study, but also just the, you know, the resources as well, and processes generally. We all have our standard operating procedures that we need to follow day to day, but often what we do in these types of outcome studies is we have a much broader set of operational plans which are specific to the study. So they are within line of our SOPs, but they do give us that flexibility. So the clinical monitoring plan, for instance, would need to be adapted, particularly around making sure that we're not forcing CRAs to go visit sites that perhaps haven't got patients or haven't got data to review, and we're not stuck to a schedule of visits, which mean that we don't need to go to some sites even for perhaps even 6 months plus. And then, do these large studies use risk-based monitoring? So yeah, that's an interesting question, because risk-based monitoring, I think many of you will be aware, means a lot of things to different people. So we tend to sort of look at monitoring more, as Nancy mentioned, as more smart and adaptive monitoring. So yes, we look at the risks. So that's where we want to go to look at the study. So in this particular instance that Nancy mentioned, where we were trying to cut costs, we looked at it and thought, well, if we're adjudicating events, then there's no risk there that source documentation is not going to be accurate, because you've got the PI reviewing it, but then you've got a separate adjudication committee looking at that data. We also, if you think about SAEs, there's a lot of scrutiny around SAEs that are reported, and we often there's a lot of work around that. Again, there may be some reduction in how much effort we put into SAEs. What we really need to think about is, are there any SAEs that haven't been reported? So that might be somewhere to look at. So yes, risk-based monitoring, whatever you would like to call it, is something that we can definitely use in these large outcome studies, and it plays a huge part in reducing costs. And interestingly enough, when I started in this industry 25 years ago, the first study that I worked on, which was a phase 3 pivotal study, 6,500 patients, we didn't do full SDV even back then, and it was accepted by the FDA. And we had some meetings with the FDA where we explained what we were doing, and they were, their attitude was, well, why wouldn't you do that? Why would you expect that we would expect you to, review all of this data? And we did an interesting exercise also where we asked the CRAs to tell us every single change that they made to the database, which reflected a change because of the source. So the sites would give us the data from the source, and then the CRAs would SDV. We only asked them to do 10% SDV. And then we analysed that. We got our statistical team to analyse it, and then sort of refer it to, well, if we found these errors in the data that we looked at, how many errors would we find in the data that we didn't look at if it was about the same, and would it affect the results of the study? And because it was an endpoint driven study, so there was a safety element and an endpoint element in there, obviously those were the risks, so we monitored that. But the other variables, like, I'm trying to think something like a 0.1 change in a lab value, or a date of birth not quite being correct, it was transposed, unless it meant that they shouldn't have been in the study, of course. That didn't affect the end points in the study, and it didn't affect the results of the study. We found no patients who were alive that should have been dead, and vice versa. So we were able to show quite robustly that reduced SDV still allows us to have a good quality database. Obviously, again, we need to make sure that the sites who are working in these types of study understands the principles, so that we can make them focus on what's important. And again, we do monitoring that allows us to look at some patients 100%. So we do get a flavour for the site. And of course, if we see that they have got missing source, or they have on an ongoing basis reporting something inappropriately or incorrectly, then obviously we're going to focus on that and do some more SDV. So yes, these types of study definitely can relate to risk-based monitoring. And I think there's going to be a lot more movement in that direction as we really understand risk-based monitoring to its extreme, which in principle allows us perhaps not even to go on site at all. We've done some work looking at perhaps even siteless siteless studies, where we can get access to electronic data, perhaps even remotely as well.
Great. Thank you, Karen. We're almost to the hour, so we are going to wrap things up. If you did ask a question that we did not get to, we will reach out to you individually. As I mentioned earlier, this webinar has been recorded, and all attendees will receive a link to access the on-demand. As Karen mentioned, you see up on the screen Karen, Nancy, and Christy's contact information, so we invite you to reach out to them directly if you have any questions. And to learn more about Worldwide, we invite you to visit worldwide.com. Thank you again, everybody, for attending. We hope you enjoyed the webinar and have a wonderful rest of your day.